Welcome to the Facts and the Furious, the podcast covering science, or lack thereof, in the Fast and Furious franchise. My name is Melissa Miller. I'm one of your hosts. I am a science writer and also host Star Warsology's podcast, which is about science and Star Wars.
And I'm Dr. Lisa Will. I'm a professor of physics and astronomy. In this episode, The Facts and the Furious is going to cover the 10th movie in the Fast and Furious franchise, 2021's F9, The Fast Saga. We'll also chat with an expert in spaceflight, Bobak Ferdowsi, so stick around for that.
All right. First, let's dive into our physics topics for this movie, F9, The Fast Saga.
Y'all ever thought about how many wild missions we've been on? And we somehow always survive?
Yeah, so far so good, I guess.
It's just luck.
No. See, y'all not listening. Think about this. We've now been on insane missions around the world, doing what most would say is damn near impossible. And I ain't got one single scar to show for it. We've taken out cars, trains, tanks. I'm not going to even mention the submarine.
And yet we're still here.
Exactly.
Ramsey, what happens when you test a theory over and over again only to come to the same result?
A hypothesis becomes fact, but you're not actually
I
suggesting
don't
that.
know, but when the improbable happens again and again, that's more than luck. Maybe we're not so normal.
That's what I'm saying. We are not normal.
Okay, and just to clarify, are you two maybe suggesting that we're what? Invincible?
Maybe.
Maybe. Or maybe you're just a dumbass.
Okay, so before we get to spaceflight, which I know we will because we have a spaceflight expert and Lisa is an astrophysicist, there's lots of other physics nonsense in this movie to talk about first.
Nonsense being the operative word there.
Yeah, I think more than any of the movies, this one is like borderline unhinged. And like it's made better because they acknowledge it, with Roman being like, I think we're invincible, and Tej being like, you should be dead, and all that stuff. But at the same time, when you just like make a list of all the ridiculous things that happens, this one's the top.
It was a very long list of things that I had to ask myself, what is going on here? And yeah, I'm glad they finally acknowledged the elephant in the room. How have they survived all of this? Because as we talked to a medical expert, they shouldn't have, especially as the stunts have ramped up by this point in the saga.
Right, exactly. Yeah, shouldn't be alive, or as Roman said, should at least have some cool scars. But I mean, there's a point in this one where Letty and Dom, early in the sequence, use part of a collapsed bridge, like a metal wire, to like slingshot themselves over nothing, over, air, to a different little island thing, and then, roll over a bunch of times, neither of which are wearing seatbelts. Glass shatters, and then Letty just says, well, that was new.
Yeah, so that was one of the many times in this particular movie where I was just looking at it going like, I don't know about that because there's so many potential points of failure, to put it politely, in that stunt. So when you look at it, you ask yourself like, okay, can you swing an object? Sure. Can you swing a car? Well, the thing I always ask about is how is the cable secured and what is it on the car that's going to be sturdy enough to bear its own weight while swinging across that span? Like, is the car chassis able to handle being swung like that? And then depending on what the cable is made out of, would the force that it feels at the end exceed what we call the elastic limit? So you know how like if you have a rubber band, it's really, really stretchy, but at some point you can stretch it till it breaks. So every material is going to have what's called its elastic limit. There are some very strong cables, so maybe, but everything just has to work just right.
They've already established that this particular cable isn't strong because this particular cable came from the bridge that has previously collapsed, I believe.
Don't think about it.
And that car just went through a minefield, which we can get into next. So like, even if it was at 100% reinforced specifically for boomeranging, flight, it has also been, half blown up 12 times or something like that in the last few minutes.
Right. And that's the other thing. Most of these cars would actually be inoperable after about the first 90 seconds of these movies because they're going down cliffs, they're crashing into barriers, and yet still they just keep going just fine. But
Yeah.
cars crumple. They're meant to crumple. They're supposed to crumple, but that crumpling usually means they don't operate well anymore.
Well, and you point out the connection point, the cable in the car. Like, if I remember correctly, Dom literally just happens to jump in such a way that the cable like tangles up in sort of like one of the front tires. Just the idea of hitting a mark like that with that exact part of your car.
So I don't know. This one made me uncomfortable.
Yeah,
of all the things in this movie.
Right. Yeah. The other car that flies in this scene, because, that's a sentence meant to, right? There is some strong magnets on a drone that swoops in and picks up John Cena. John Cena's in this movie. He's Dom's shabbily sort of retconned brother. This movie opens with a bunch of flashbacks and stuff like that. But no real physics conundrum so much in that one. But yes, we'll get into the magnets. I know we'll get into the magnets plenty more, but that one at least was intended to fly, right? That one jumps off a cliff knowing it will be grabbed by a magnet, whereas Letty watches Dom set up this whole thing of like, don't worry, the bridge is out. We're going to use, this cable, and just kind of is like, all right, doesn't even buckle her seatbelt. So
yeah, seatbelts do not seem to be a priority in these movies. So once again, don't try this at home.
Exactly.
Do we want to talk about the electromagnet on the plane now?
We certainly can. My only note about it was ask Lisa if magnets really go when they're turned on.
I don't usually think of magnets tending to make noise, but the generator that would need to produce the amount of power to actually turn on the electromagnet might. So it might not be the electromagnet itself, but the part of it ramping it up.
Okay.
Can a magnet pick up a car? Absolutely. There are electromagnets used in junkyards and stuff like that. That's actually fine, right? That's not quite the same as picking one up in midair. It kind of knows where the car is and it's starting off from rest. One of the things you need with magnets, you need to make a good connection. And so is it even grabbing it at the right surface area? So even that stunt would need a lot of help. It would need to be just perfect. But I still think hitting a car in flight with an electromagnet and being able to pick it up, we didn't really see the plane picking up the car react much to this new weight of the car.
Ah, yes.
Because now you've changed the aerodynamics. It's one of the things that it's just like, can we make it work? Sure, if everything just happens just perfectly. But these scenarios aren't that well planned.
Right. No, and what my husband and I, when we watched it last night, really noticed was how conveniently the magnets work. Between this scene, and then there's the scene with the truck in Edinburgh, and then there's the final car chase where everybody gets a magnet in their cars. And, there's that, we're literally reversing polarity, right? For all the jokes that, reversing the polarity fixes everything in like Star Trek or whatever. But they also work however you need them to, right? So when it's the truck, it's only attracting things, right? Things are only flying and hitting the truck and getting connected to the truck. Whereas in the car chase, they're getting attracted to whatever's right behind you conveniently instead of to you. So they can like use it to get all these cars to hit cars around them, the bad guys' cars or whatever. It's just convenient. We know how generally magnets work, and the writers and the stunt coordinators and all of that were just like, well, however we need it to work, that's how magnets work.
So this is one of the times where watching the movie for the first time, I was just laughing the entire time, right? Because as you're saying, it's very convenient. Magnets aren't picky. They're not going to pick a car, but not the watch and the jewelry from the person wearing them next to the car. Magnets aren't that selective. So that's one of the biggest problems in this scene. I'm just like, there are so many unintended casualties that should have been happening, but our heroes don't do that, right?
Right.
But people should have been getting hit by just like flying shrapnel from little bits of metal getting attracted by these really bizarrely powerful magnets. Like the magnets needed for this scene, you wouldn't be powering them on the back of a truck.
Okay. Strong magnets do exist, right? This is a thing.
Magnets absolutely do exist. Electromagnets can be really, really, really strong, but they're called electromagnets because they're not refrigerator magnets. They're not what we call permanent magnets. They are magnetic because you're running currents through them, and those moving currents and changing currents can actually create magnetic fields. And so that's why they're called electromagnets. Think of it this way, you need electricity to power them of some sort. Okay. So this is not just a really strong permanent magnet that they're taking around, but in both cases, they're not this selective.
Right. I can't remember if you said it in one of our previous episodes or if you said it just to me one time about all of the underwire bras that would be ripped through
Yes.
people's shirts and stuck to the side of this truck in Edinburgh.
That's one of the first things I thought of watching this was, no, those poor women. But also, I just remember once having a colleague, somebody had left out a strong permanent magnet on a workbench in the stockroom. It was one of those really strong neodymium magnets that I don't recommend you play with unless you know how to handle magnets, but somebody had just left one out. And one of my colleagues had a metal watch and he was just walking by, and that magnet actually jumped and hit him in the watch. It could have broken his wrist.
Right.
I mean, that's how strong magnets can be. Now, that also brings up, shouldn't the truck that our heroes are driving, shouldn't that be attracted to some of the objects that they're pulling through? And that's just Newton's third law, the action reaction forces. In the case of my colleague walking by with the watch, the force of the magnet on the watch and the force of the watch on the magnet were the same, but he was heavier than the magnet. So the magnet jumped to him. And so, yeah, there's really no way that they could have been driving safely. Well, okay,
right.
Safely. What am I even talking about? Safe, right? Their ability to drive with a sense of purposeful direction would have been affected by all the stuff coming towards the magnet.
Right. Like in Fast Five, we applauded their effort to show that the cars would be like off some wheels and skidding around corners because of this safe flying around everywhere. And in this one, it really was like, no, I'm the magnet. So everything either comes to me or is repelled from me, not any sort of, matching forces where if you weigh the same, you meet in the middle, or if you weigh, twice as much, you meet a third of the way there and things like that.
And we're just talking about the stuff that's attracted to the magnet. They have pretty much erased every hard drive, right? With this electromagnet would have been damaging electronic media. Yeah, their cell phones probably weren't that happy now that I think about it.
Right, exactly. Well, and they're communicating because I know in Edinburgh they say, oh, it's been turned on. And so like the surveillance cameras are down and those sorts of things. But like the whole time they're communicating. And this one, I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but this like pet peeve of mine where like some people are talking into walkie-talkies, some people have an earpiece, and they're all communicating on one network or whatever. I mean, at this point, literally some people are in space and they're also communicating with them. Like it's just the communications array that these people have access to is amazing and apparently not affected by the strongest electromagnets you've ever seen.
Yeah. It's good to be part of the family.
Right. Well, and what I also liked was when they're in the like whatever sewer lair of Mr. Nobody, they turn on the electromagnets and like the pins of these grenades get pulled out, but not the grenades themselves. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know what grenades are made out of, but probably metal also.
Maybe we're supposed to think that the grenades were fastened securely enough that only the pins would move.
Right. Really strong Velcro strapped into everybody's. Fair enough. No, I buy it. That's good enough for me.
I love magnets and I am always happy to see magnets in movies. Like they don't really work like that, but yay.
I'll have to remember because I'm watching Fast 10 again this week. But it's, every time they soup up their cars with these new and interesting things and then they don't ever show up again. But the magnets thing seems like it should be an ongoing, maybe that's how Tej and Roman survive plane crash or, whatever else in the future. It's like, oh yeah, we just kept some of the magnets from the last movie. But is there anything else, Lisa, that we haven't gotten into that we definitely should?
Only if you wanted to talk about the minefields, but the answer could you navigate the minefield like this is no. So
the answer is just no. We talked about it a little bit with our driving expert, right? In terms of they always film these sequences much slower and then speed them up for the movie. But I was thinking about it. I like that they take a moment to do the math. Dom over the comms is like, Tej, how fast do we have to go to outrun Mind Blast? Yes. And you can see that, Tej thinks about it and even like voices some of the math, right? Like, assuming the blast radius is 50 feet, basically the car needs to be going so fast that by the time you've triggered it, you are also 50 feet away. So some math goes into it. And that's like, I feel like the first time they acknowledged that some calculations instead of Dom just like, looking, serious for a second and being like, let's do this. So I liked that, even if it's not true.
I think the thing is they did the blast radius, which is an important thing. But the other thing is what delay are these mines on? And so not being a weapons expert myself,
right?
But I think you would need to know the specific type of mine to know what the delay is. And so that's going to make a difference if it goes off immediately because I think if you look at the calculations, they're not going so fast that if it's on a tiny delay, will they be out of the way? I wasn't incredibly comfortable with them going through this minefield.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and it's one thing if the cars can outrun it too, but at one point Roman outruns one of the blasts.
Yeah, yeah. No, that actually got me. I was like, okay, a couple minutes ago, the same people on screen right now, established that you have to be 50 feet away. And then Roman is all of like 10 feet, maybe.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but you just told us 50 feet. Okay, so we're definitely going to get into a lot of this with Bobak Ferdowsi, but we should at least start talking now about this whole space flight of it all.
So in this movie, the Fast Saga finally goes to space, which I guess we should have seen it coming. Yeah,
should we have? I don't know that we should have.
So what I really thought was interesting about this is that they had to build in an entire segment where the dudes from Tokyo Drift reappear, and they look like they're hiding on a runway doing these experiments in secret. And I love that they realized that in the writing, they realized, okay, we're going to need to justify how we can actually get something into space. So we better show at least that somebody's been experimenting with rockets on a car.
Right.
Why you would pick a Pontiac Fiero, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, they didn't have the foresight to put it in like a previous movie. So they just put it in a previous scene in this movie. I did also, this most recent rewatch, really feel like they chose these three people so that they could have them reunite with Han at the end. Right. Because also, spoilers, Han's alive as of F9. Yay, Han!
Yay! Everybody's favorite's back. Yay!
So I was like, was it sort of two birds with one stone? Like, okay, wait, we need to introduce space travel possibilities, and also Han's back, so might as well bring, these three people who we haven't seen in many moons. And they just sort of a quick, like, he's a rocket scientist, the other guys are, still sort of just good with cars, and so this is what they're doing for a living or something like that. Sure, good enough. And then later they're like piloting a full-on huge like Air Force looking jet. Sure, okay, fine.
Because piloting just like driving a car, apparently.
Right. Well, and it's it's that line you like of I had a life before you. Like
oh, that is one of the best lines in this entire franchise. Yeah, I love that because you can get away with anything.
Don't even try to figure out how many years it's been since Tokyo Drift, because technically that happened after movie 6. So really it's only been a few years. Those children are quite old looking, but that's okay. We just accept these things because we will accept anything as long as you bring Han back.
Wow, that's incredibly true.
Yeah. But yes, we've got our 2-second car instead of 10-second car. And then they launch into space. And I don't know how Tej and Roman ended up with the assignment, but I love those guys and their bickering in space.
It had to be the two of them because you needed Roman to freak out about things and for Tej to bring him back. Although the line, as long as we obey the laws of physics, we will be fine. I love the acknowledgement. Hey, the audience is going to wonder if we can pull this off. Right. We're just going to tell them we are following the laws of physics and the audience will be fine, just like we will.
Well, and I think that that's the most ridiculous moment maybe in all of these things because, you and I obviously notorious overthinkers of the Fast and Furious franchise. Here we are in episode 10 of our podcast about it. But even if you are the least overthinking person about these movies, even if you are just like, yeah, explosions, cars, muscles, I still think when Tej says, as long as we obey the laws of physics, we will be fine, while they're in space or strapped to an Air Force jet at the time, perhaps going up into space, I think you still snort with laughter. Like, yes. I think you still see what they're doing. Yes. Like, you're trying to tell me you obeyed the laws of physics this whole time. I know you haven't, but delightful.
It is an incredibly self-aware movie.
Something noteworthy about it has nothing to do with physics. Is this the first time Dominic Toretto has been a passenger in a vehicle? Is when Queenie is driving around having stolen a necklace.
I love that scene. Well, first of all, I love Helen Mirren and I love this character. If Dom's going to be taken for a ride by anyone, it's going to be by her.
Yeah, total icon. I'll have to add this to my things to rewatch for, but is Dominic Toretto ever a passenger other than in Queenie's car, which would make me happy if he isn't.
If he would have been, it would have had to have been very early in the movies, like with Brian, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Him
Like,
and Brian did like drive up the coast for a romantic lunch at some point, right?
Yeah.
So who was driving? Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that had nothing to do with physics. What's funny to me is that before we met with Bobak, I watched, there's a cut of the Fast and Furious Go to Space. You know, that is like all, whatever, 5 minutes of it just pieced together. But I forget that in the movie, it's interspersed with this magnet, beast, car chase, everything's going on. And it's all this crazy loud stuff. And then it will just cut to the Pontiac Fiero in space. And like every time I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Tej and Roman are in space right now.
And the space stuff is the quiet, peaceful stuff. Because I love that they actually gave a moment for Tej and Roman to react to the beauty of being in space. That they actually
Yes.
did have that moment, though. They're just like, wow, we're in space.
Agreed. You have to have that sort of blue marble, there's no borders down there. Everything that you hear astronauts talk about, William Shatner talked about it when he went recently, like that moment. I agree. And then, they're back at the family barbecue or whatever at the end of the movie and talking about having eaten space food for weeks because apparently they were on the ISS for weeks, which I get. Like, if you just show up at the ISS, how are you getting home? So what's the plan?
Usually, flights back from the ISS are scheduled far in advance. It's not rated to take on additional passengers, but it doesn't always have the same number of astronauts or cosmonauts on it at any given time. So maybe this was a case where they didn't have a full complement, and so that they could take on a few more crew for a while. They usually do have an emergency escape vehicle. There's usually some sort of Soyuz, I think, docked
Oh, yeah. Okay.
to the ISS, but they're not gonna just say, okay, well, we had to pick up these dudes. We're just gonna
Right.
to let them take it back. So I'm assuming that there was a scheduled mission that they went back on, and maybe some of the ISS crew just extended their mission longer so that these two guys can come back.
No, and it's a good point. I'd like to think actually that bumping someone from the next return kind of makes sense. I had never thought about the fact that there's some sort of escape vehicle, but that makes sense for if the ISS is in trouble. And I mean, these guys did save the planet, right? I mean, if word gets out that this satellite launched and was going to connect to the two halves of this bowl that was connected biologically to this girl, that was going to hack into everything. Am I remembering the premise of this movie right? Then, if all that comes out, then they're heroes. And so, the space programs of various countries would be like, oh, yeah, sure. Like, you can bump, our next people or something like that. All in all, delightful movie. Hopefully everyone enjoys the rewatch. Our Rotten Tomatoes score for this one. Oh, the tomato meter is only a 59%. Come on, critics. This was a fun movie. Audience meter, 82%. Again, a pretty wide difference there because, yeah, it's fun. And the one sentence review here is F9 sends the franchise hurtling further over the top than ever. But director Justin Lin's knack for preposterous set pieces keeps the action humming. Yes, and this movie, so came out in 2021, was definitely part of, the pandemic, definitely was, I remember being delayed and all of that. F9. It will always hold a special place in my heart for its complete and utter escapism.
Absolutely. And I think, we've talked about it before, but my husband and I came to this franchise during the pandemic, and it was just much needed escapism. Whereas my brain gets engaged while watching, going like, that Fiero isn't doing that. I am still wholly invested in the ride.
Yes, well said. All right, well, let's get into our interview with Bobak Ferdowsi. I honestly can't believe that we managed to get him to come talk Fast and Furious with us.
Are you really patching yourself up with duct tape?
Yes. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but this whole operation is Band-Aids and duct tape.
Man, this is insane. We are headed to outer space. You acting like we on our way to Home Depot. This is ridiculous, man. I'm about to abort this whole mission and take my black ass home.
We're literally gonna be in a perpetual free fall.
Free fall? What does that even mean?
Roman, it means numbers don't lie. As long as we obey the laws of physics, then we'll be fine, okay? It's just all math and science.
I knew I should have listened to my teachers.
In this episode, the Facts and the Furious is going to chat about spaceflight in the saga. Our guest expert today, sorry, that just makes me laugh every time, the fact that we get there. Our guest expert today is Bobak Ferdowsi, a system engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Welcome, Bobak.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about Fast and Furious.
We're definitely excited to have you because we have so many questions.
Yeah, this is definitely the episode Lisa, I think, has been waiting for and agreed to do the podcast just so that we could talk to someone at NASA, although I know you're not representing NASA here in Fast and Furious. And my guess is they did not consult NASA on this particular spaceflight.
I'm not aware. Yeah, I didn't see any credits at the end. It says, thank you to the National International Space Administration for their advice on this movie. So
Yeah, it's a particularly fun sequence. I don't know if you've watched all of the saga of Fast and Furious, but the escalation really comes to its culmination with Tej and Roman in space.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've watched them all many times. And I also was waiting for the moment that it would eventually go to space. I was very thankful that it finally happened.
Yeah, and really, where do you go from here? I keep waiting for time travel next.
It's got to be what it is, right? Yeah.
Aliens. Got to bring in the aliens next.
Oh, goodness.
Crossover time. So before we get into talking about spaceflight in Fast and Furious, can you quickly define what a system engineer does and tell us how you got into this field?
Sure. I got into this mostly because I liked sci-fi as a kid, but then thought that space was sort of the thing that astronauts do and was like, I'm not going to be an astronaut. That seems impossible. But in 1997, Jet Propulsion Lab, where I work, actually landed a relatively small rover called Sojourner, the rover. The mission was called Pathfinder, landing on Mars on 4th of July, 1997. And that was the first time, you kind of see pictures happening live on the internet from another world. You got to see the team members who were working on it. That's when it kind of clicked that there were a lot of engineers and scientists behind, the pictures and the things that I had seen in textbooks that kind of felt, I guess, a little distant until that moment. And that's when it clicked that I could do that. So that was sort of the pursuit was from that point forward. And I studied aerospace engineering in college and grad school. And I got really, really, really lucky that a classmate of mine got hired before me and was able to put in a good word for me and started out there. And system engineering is, this application of, we've realized that these spacecraft have become incredibly complex and it requires sort of an engineering, conductor, so to speak, to make sure that all the parts come together, right? You have your experts in, propulsion, your experts in power, and your experts in avionics and software and all those different domains. But then you need someone who's making sure all those parts play nicely together, that that you can coordinate the spacecraft pointing with the power that you need to generate on the solar rays, or the pointing of the antenna relative to the spacecraft body, and all those different things.
It's great that you mentioned the sort of team aspect and how you saw that in 1997, because that's really my favorite part about, logging on to NASA TV or whatever when there's one of these launches or returns or anything like that, is all the different windows, of the teams around the world, because that's a part of science that's not well represented in many reports and also definitely in movies and stuff like that.
It's not, and I think it's easy to forget when you see a picture of something that it feels it's a robot somewhere, or it's an isolated picture of a planet, and you don't realize the incredibly, one, bespoke nature of every one of those spacecraft that we build, but two, the thousands of people who, are involved and, put years of their lives into making those things happen. So that outpouring of emotion that you see, with the capsule landings and the launches and everything else, it's so refreshing, and it's really reminds you this is a human endeavor, even if it's our proxies that are, the robots doing it.
Well, you mentioned having watched the Fast and Furious movies. Were you able to enjoy F9 and the spaceflight sequence of it all? Or were you critiquing their preparation or lack thereof while watching it for the first time?
Sorry, I'm laughing.
I mean, it felt a little fourth wall to me, because it's I was laughing the whole time, at the ridiculousness of it. But it's still Fast and Furious. It's exactly what I would have expected from this series. Have they tried to be incredibly faithful to the physics and recreate a launch sequence and had all these different, and had all of a NASA control room working on it, it would have made no sense whatsoever, right? So the idea that it's this ad hoc, couple of people figuring stuff out, strapping things together, it feels exactly in family. And I mean, this movie also was I think the most self-aware of the movies so far, right? It kind of really leaned into that this is its own universe. So right. I thought it played in perfectly.
Yeah, and it contains one of my favorite lines in all the movies, which is when Tej says, "As long as we obey the laws of physics, we will be fine." I love that
Yeah.
complete addressing of the ridiculousness.
And Roman being like, we're invincible, we should be dead.
Yes.
It's like, yeah, this movie having that sort of audience point of view on those aspects. So what about this launch? Maybe if the first time you're able to just sort of laugh and enjoy it, but like now that we've sort of asked you to analyze it a little bit, what do you notice about this particular space launch? And I say that definitely in a loose quotes, in terms of strapping a Pontiac Fiero to a jet, the takeoff, there's separating of parts as soon as they, reach orbit, and then the maneuverability as well. There's a lot going on there.
The first part, it's kind of cool though, because they start out with the airplane, at the Fiero, and there are elements of that are really, accurate to our own space program, right? So the X-15 program was America's first endeavor into human kind of operability in space. And, they would launch it from the bottom of I can't remember what it was, one of the larger bombers at the time. It would ignite an engine, be able to, go up to nearly vacuum, or very high atmosphere. And they had to control it not using, aerodynamic surfaces, but thrusters to basically do roll and yaw and pitch. So there's like these elements of that, and then recently you have like the Pegasus rocket vehicles that launched, from the underwing of a plane, and now the Virgin Galactic as well, right? That carried under plane. So there's like a lot of accurate, stuff to it. Cars aren't ideal shapes necessarily for going into space. They're very asymmetric, which is a problem when you're trying to control a surface and not start veering in the wrong direction. But maybe we'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they're high enough altitude where the aerodynamics are less of a factor. But that part, I kind of liked it. Kind of looking at the control, right? They have a couple of, fun things that still feel like someone's watched a rocket launch before when they wrote this scene, right? With the boosters that are kind of separating from the vehicle. I would say that trying to control it looked very impossible because none of those rockets looked like they had any ability to do anything other than aim forward and fire. So there didn't look like there was a great way to, keep your nose pointed in the right direction on any of those things. But, in terms of, could you try to, like, if I were building it from a car, could I put little small thrusters on the front of the car to sort of keep the nose pointed in the right direction? Or you could gimbal the engines in the back, right? Strap on one engine that you could sort of pivot or so that you could kind of, control it. Yeah, I think it's doable. People use video game controllers for all sorts of things. And, I don't see why you couldn't do a steering wheel that could kind of do it. But you would need, kind of like the F1 cars, right? You would need an ability not just for turning, but you'd have to be able to go up and down too, right? Yeah. I mean, it seems plausible. I feel like you could retcon anything in these movies if you really want to.
So true. So I like that you say that it seems plausible. So one of the things in this movie, though, is that this seems to have happened over the course of like, I don't know, a day. Like, how long did it take for them to put this together? So what's the feasibility of putting together a space flight in a day?
That one seems less plausible. Could you strap rockets to a thing? Absolutely. I'm, in the history of the Darwin Awards, I'm sure there have been some attempts. In an early jet propulsion laboratory, right, they were strapping those jet-assisted takeoff rockets to things, probably with a little bit more analysis before doing it. But arguably, if you had some spare solid rocket boosters lying around, you could definitely strap them to a car and see what you could do with it. I would definitely say things like, trying to make a steering wheel into a control mechanism is not something that could happen in a matter of a day or two, right? Because there's a lot of clever engineering that would be required to think, what do I want it to do when I turn left, or if I pull on the steering wheel or push on it, or I guess, they had physically probably making it look like what it looked like is probably doable in a day.
Right.
Making it actually work with some sort of software, to control the wheel to the thrusters and things like that. It seems even in the Fast and Furious universe, it'd probably take you days, if not weeks or months to at least prototype something like that.
Watching the scene again this morning, I didn't remember that Roman also uses the pedals and the gear shift. And I wonder if that's actually connected to anything, or if it's just, his usual sort of, okay, we're going forward, I gotta shift, I gotta, put my right foot down, kind of muscle memory even.
I mean, it feels like it'd be muscle memory. Otherwise, there would probably, like I said, be a lot of engineering going into how each of those things would somehow control some aspect of spaceflight.
Well, what about the gear that they wear, which, I think they even say is like old diving suits, definitely gives you scuba vibes and stuff like that. How does that sort of compare to what a person would actually need to be wearing inside a Pontiac Fiero in space?
Well, they definitely allude to it a little bit, right? They mentioned that, the suits will inflate a little bit. That's the big challenge of using a spacesuit. Keeping a pressure difference between you and the outside world is hard, but, it's pretty understandable, right? Just make sure you don't have leaks and you should be mostly okay. There's some nuance to that, of course, with like, your ears and other things and the pressures that you feel. But the big challenge is, making a suit that doesn't just expand so that your fingers aren't just, giant hot dogs or whatever trying to operate something in space, right? And that's where Apollo astronauts and everything else right there, it's a lot of strapping the suit into place and really trying to make it be, fitted to the body in a way that they can still move their legs and their body parts. If you kind of imagine yourself as the Michelin Man or something like that, right? It would be very hard to move around or to physically like touch your steering wheel or shift a gear knob or anything like that. So I think that's where they joke about it, but they don't have to solve the problem of it. And I think that's probably where those suits would break down pretty quickly, right? In terms of the practicality, they'd be giant, pods instead of spacesuits.
And once again, with the spacesuits, they invoked some duct tape. Like duct tape is good enough to patch up one of these leaks. And I feel like duct tape has been associated with the space program for a long time. How often does it actually get used?
I mean, I can't say because on robots, we don't use duct tape, but I feel like there's got to be a role of duct tape or its equivalent in space. The stuff that's short term probably works, right? You don't probably have to think very much about what the material is made of if you're not trying to protect sensitive optics or worry about gumming up some sort of, piece of hardware that has to last for another 10 years in space. So, some level, I can imagine something like a duct tape being just fine for, a couple hours in space. But, if you're really trying to do that for something long term, right, there's all sorts of things like the outgassing, right, which is that kind of like that new car smell is all those plastics and materials outgassing their, organic compounds. You'd have that same problem, right? And if you had enough of that stuff, your windows that were cold would get caked in this sort of residual gunk. Couldn't see out your windows. But for tens of minutes, it's probably not going to do enough damage. I can't say that I'm particularly qualified for human space flight since I've never done it, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. You don't have the human factor in most of the projects that you've worked on.
Right. But, if you were thinking about that, like, right, how long would it be exposed to cold? Does duct tape perform well in cold weather? Does the adhesive come off if it gets exposed to direct sunlight and it's now getting to be incredibly hot? All those different things.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the cold, I was like, oh, they do sort of show progressively over the few minutes of that scene, this sort of frost coming in on their diving helmets and along the windows and stuff like that. So maybe someone at least was like in post-production was just like, oh, they'd be a little bit of frost here. So sounds like that was realistic at least.
Well, they were in the sun, so they would actually probably have a harder time getting cold than they would being too hot. It's hard to lose heat in space as well. You're getting heat from the sun, there's no air around you to convect heat too. So you're just radiating heat back. So probably should be the other problem where they're overheating more than they're cooling off.
Now I have the urge to go back and look at the length of the scene and try to actually calculate their orbit by how often.
Yeah, like did they go through, right? Yeah. Like how many orbits did they do? Were they behind the Earth for a while?
Yep.
Because I think you get pretty warm in a hurry.
There you go. That's the difference between someone who does space for a living and me who watches space on movies and stuff like that, where it's like, no, it's cold in space, right? No, it's one or the other. It's very cold or very hot.
Yeah.
Right. Spacecraft are meticulously designed for that purpose, right? To keep one side of them usually away from the sun so they can lose heat. Otherwise, all those electronics and everything else will cook.
Yeah, I like to point that out to my students when showing them the design of JWST and how that huge part of it's actually just a sun shield itself.
Yeah, that's so cool. What a phenomenal piece of engineering. Yeah.
Works.
Very opposite. I mean, you think about that, you compare that to making a human-rated spacecraft in a couple of days versus something that took 20 years to make.
Oh, yeah. We've been talking about whether or not the Pontiac Fiero would be able to get into space in a couple of days. Roman and Tej went to space and back without any training. How feasible is that to just send someone up into space?
I mean, I think the hardest part is probably the preparation physically for a lot of the things, at least prepping yourself, right, to not pass out while you're accelerating up to orbital speeds. And I think that's probably where, you'd first encounter the issues. Both of them would probably immediately, blank out through the acceleration. And then their car would be aiming wherever it last was pointed. the rest of it, they're not operating super complex machinery, it seems like. So I guess there's not a lot of training with, what would I do in case of an emergency? Oh, if there's an oxygen leak in this compartment, how would I seal it? Because a lot of the training for human spaceflight is dealing with all the uncertainty and issues that can pop up and things like that. I think they're sort of banking on what we would call success-oriented mission, which is assume it's going to go well. And if it doesn't, that's unfortunate, but that's the end of the mission. In a Pontiac Fiero, I'm pretty sure there's not much you can do.
And I mean, I know that you're not a human spaceflight expert or anything like that, but just I think anecdotally, we can agree that probably Tej and Roman would not be paired up on a spaceflight just because of their constant bickering and things like that. Like, that's not, if I was in charge of crew morale, I wouldn't put those two necessarily together.
Yeah, we didn't talk about the space psychology, but again, they're not gone for long. So, it's not like they have to. I always thought about that because, they're talking about those human missions to Mars. But the idea was just to do, a figure eight right there and back again, and not even land, but just do the trip to Mars and back. And they were in the human capsule. And I was like, there is nobody in the world. I could not spend, 500 days in a vehicle the size of a car. I just couldn't do it. I would rather I think at that point, I'd be like, I would rather be alone.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. The psychology for sure is a thing. And I mean, you're right that they're only there and for a short time. And I guess we do also have like 4 or 5 movies worth of Tej and Roman getting along well enough to get the mission done, right? Just bickering constantly. Yeah. So maybe it'd be more of an annoyance for ground control, people to have.
From an engineering perspective, they're a proven quantity, right? So they're, they can do the job.
I mean, as a former chemist, I did like just the random materials that they threw out there. There's like foil lining in the car, the duct tape sequence, ceramic polymer is fireproof. Yeah. I didn't even check that if that's true, but I just sort of liked those terms and those things in the background.
I feel like it's like LaCroix, like the flavor of the water is like something else was in the room. And there was like somewhere in the room where these writers were, there was like, we had a poster about science. And you're like, yeah, I can see that.
Right. Yeah. Maybe the like magic school bus, we went to space book or something like that. Yeah. Right. If a school bus can go to space, why not a Pontiac Fiero?
I think the last technical question I have is, the last we see Roman and Tej, they're leaving the Fiero in their spacesuits. It's implied that they get onto the ISS somehow. How did it?
Yeah, they didn't show that scene, and I'd be very curious. I mean, there's an airlock, so I guess if you could rendezvous with it, but I mean, like that's kind of amazing, right? Like a rendezvous in space is like an incredibly challenging problem that usually involves hours of, slowly approaching your target. The odds that you're just randomly launched from Germany somewhere at some inclination, and then magically you're in the same orbital path as the space station. Because sure, your orbits could cross, right? But I mean, orbits crossing, you're both traveling 17,000 miles an hour, whatever it is. The ability to actually time those things is impossible. So you're really trying to get in the same orbit, which I don't know you can eyeball very well without actually, some sort of navigational telemetry to let you know, okay, you're the same angle now as the ISS. That one is definitely, I would say, probably not a chance for that to happen.
Okay. I was really curious about that because I looked at that and I'm like, yeah, they faded to black there for a reason.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe they started working on that scene. They're like, you know what? No, we just go back to the car chase that we're interspersing this with, and then they're on land. It's fine.
I mean, they had to rescue them, obviously. We can't have anything happen to our heroes. But
right, exactly. Well, and I was also thinking about like the threat of a Pontiac Fiero to the ISS, right? I know that I've heard about like space junk and stuff like that. Like little tiny, quarter-sized piece of space junk can potentially be a threat at those speeds and stuff like that in orbit. So I can't even imagine what the ISS was thinking as they watched like a car approach them.
It's far more likely in this scenario. It's not like the ISS has to maneuver to match the orbit of the Fiero, and then you try to use that, that Canada arm on the edge of it to slowly bring it at least to a resting position relative to you, right? Assuming it, doesn't have much more fuel in it. But I think that's the only way that would happen, right? Is that somehow somebody on the ground, like a NORAD, tracks this rocket launch, realizes there's 2 people on board, and somehow the ISS is in a near enough orbit that they can maneuver. The ISS is not a vehicle known for its rapid changes in orbit.
I know, and now I was just thinking their diving suits, I don't think they had those little spacewalk jetpacks on them, so I'm really not sure
But you could just like let some of the air out if you just, just
Yeah.
needed to thrust a little bit, poke a hole,
They,
small pinhole. Yeah.
yeah, hopefully they saw The Martian. I can't, before they.
Yeah.
Hopefully The Martian is in universe, canonical. Well, is there anything else that you saw in the sequence that you want to make sure to call out, good or bad or silly?
My favorite part really was just that the launching on a plane was something that we've done before, and it was like I don't think it was intentional necessarily. It was a clever way of getting, the movie plot, but also something realistic.
Well, and you mentioned that all of the ones that have happened in reality was the vehicle under the plane.
Yes, you'll basically take out your
of the plane
vehicle.
looked-
Yeah. I mean, that'd be very dangerous because it's very hard to separate. The body above you is not going to glide very well. And no matter how good you are, you probably can't aim downwards fast enough for that car to just not want to stay with you.
Right. No, because the way that this launches from the top of the plane and like immediately falls back and just, narrowly misses the tail of the plane. I was like, that can't be the right way to do that. So it turns out it's not the right way to do that.
No, I mean, they carried the shuttle on the plane, but obviously they never tried to launch the shuttle from those carrier planes.
Right. But maybe that's just what the writers were, thinking
Yeah.
of the visual, because that we've all seen. So, yeah.
I guess there was the James Bond movie, Moonraker, where they steal the shuttle from on top of that plane and somehow manage to ignite the engine.
There you go. If we're going back to James Bond movies for our...
Yeah. For accurate representation of historical events.
Well, are there any other movies or shows that you've watched that you feel like portray spaceflight and sort of the teams and the time and all that kind of stuff that goes into it? Are there any good standout examples to you, or negative examples like the Core or something? I imagine it's not super realistic,
but I do love the Core. I think part of the thing is, like, at least for me as an engineer, anytime you put these sort of ridiculous movies in front of me, even if it's not realistic, part of my brain is like, but how would I solve that problem? So I kind of enjoy them anyway because they're like preposterous in that regard. But then my little brain wants to think about, like, well, what would I do if they gave me 20 days to build a vehicle to go to the center of the Earth? So I think it's just kind of fun. But there's not a lot of stuff that really shows the huge amount of human effort that goes into it. You get a couple shows like For All Mankind and things like that where you see at least a little bit more of the workings of a facility, and that's kind of cool. And there's shows like The Expanse, which really, I would say nail the physics of, for the most part, nail the physics. Of course, they even have to create some engineering plot devices in order to allow transit between planets to be reasonable times. But that and the miniseries, right, for the Apollo 13 miniseries as well was also very insightful. There's the episode where they talk about building the LEM, and that one was a great one. If you're an engineer and you're like, how did they do this stuff? It was cool to see an episode about not just the astronauts going to the moon, but the engineers behind that. Those are some of my favorite examples.
Yeah, I guess more than our other guests, your expertise has movies that specifically are about that, right? These things that are specifically about the space program, you'd like to think they get some of those aspects of it more right versus like in disaster movies. Armageddon and The Core, I imagine, not so much.
I love those movies. I love those movies. And there's movies like Space Camp, which are like, somewhere in the middle, and they're still ridiculous, and I still love them. They're fun. But yeah, I like I said, there's a level of me that is, I'm sure that maybe is not true for everybody, but I definitely enjoy part of those movies because of the engineering problem itself.
Well, clearly got the right mindset, because that's definitely how Lisa and I found each other was, okay, we're seeing these things, we know they're wrong, but instead of just brushing them off, it's like, but how would you do that?
How would you do it? So one of the questions we ask everyone is, do you have a favorite Fast and Furious character?
Oh boy, I've never really thought about this. I really don't know that I have a favorite.
What about a favorite vehicle that they use?
Oh man. I mean, I do love the Hulk Scion in Tokyo Drift a lot, but that's because I'm like, I can't see myself being like a Mitsubishi Eclipse driver or any of those cars, right? So I feel like something quirky and a little ridiculous feels like it screams me more than like American muscle or kind of Japanese like sports cars.
That was also something we wanted to ask about, if you're open to talking about it, that I saw that you went to an American school in Tokyo. If you've seen Tokyo Drift, is there any insights into the realistic portrayal of that sort of upbringing?
I mean, there were one, that school is like a weird hybrid between trying to be like at least having a lot of international kids at it, but still look sort of like a Japanese school. I did both. I went to an American school and I also went to a Japanese school for a little bit. But even the Japanese school I went to didn't force... I didn't have to wear a uniform when I went to my Japanese school, but, you'd see a lot of other schools that did that. So that part they were trying to do then. And the international school thing, I mean, none of us were driving. Cars in Japan are like really difficult to drive. You have to do like these very intensive learning courses. It costs a lot of money because they basically have these, not miniature, but they have these recreations of like a city landscape. You drive by a driving school and they would have a small intersection contained inside the driving school that you could practice coming to a stop and, waiting for the other car or doing whatever. In a city like Tokyo, you can imagine having that much land and then, all those things. So I think the cost of getting a license in Japan is pretty prohibitive for most high school students. And I can't remember what the legal driving age is, but I don't remember at 16, being an option to go get my learner's permit or anything like that. So that felt a little ridiculous. I definitely was not cool enough to be going to like, whatever chop shops and things like that when I was in high school. So, and most of us just took the train to school, like it was like, oh, take the train. It's so nice when you live in a city to have public transit. But I used to tell people that it was very similar to my school, just to as like an opening conversation. Then I would tell them it was not at all like my school.
Well, you mentioned when we started that, seeing the NASA teams and stuff like that for the Sojourner mission really inspired you to become an engineer. I mean, I feel like your, notoriety or stuff like that started really with the same thing, right? Us seeing you on the NASA stream and stuff like that for the Curiosity rover. Do you hear that you inspired, the younger generation into similar fields?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pretty amazing, because occasionally like an intern or now, early career folks will come up and say that they watched the Curiosity landing and that was the reason why they wanted to go into this. So that it's been really cool. And it really made me, one of the things that it really brings me joy about this endeavor is like the space program and, science and engineering and things like that. The stuff we're doing is multi-generational and you see it kind of repeat over and over again, right? You see, I worked a little bit before the current mission on a mission to Europa called Clipper. And, a number of the project scientists who are working there are, later in their career. And this is a mission that will take years to get out there and years to return the science. And so for a lot of these folks, right, they're paying it forward to the next generation of scientists who are going to write dissertations and, prolific papers on what we find from that mission. And I love that in my way, got to be part of that with seeing a Mars mission and being inspired to come here. And then now, right, there's another generation that saw the Mars mission that I worked on and is inspired to come here. And so I kind of love that, this thing that we can never quite answer, but we can keep making progress and paving the way for people to carry the sort of the torch a little bit further. It's such a wonderful thing. It's frustrating at sometimes though too, right? Because I would love, oh my God, would I love to know all the answers about life in the universe and everything else. But it's so cool to know that like you got to be part of something that was so much bigger than you. So I think it's really lovely to be in that environment. And, as a icing on the cake that I got my own sort of ability to do that at a personal level to inspire others. But I think the missions speak for themselves, honestly. They're so cool. And yeah, you see, I've watched that video of us landing a number of times and just watching the outpouring of human emotion really tells you everything you need to know about what it's like to work there. True joy. I couldn't think of a better image of what it really means to see human relief and joy.
I was just thinking of the 7 minutes of terror, as y'all called it. And
Yeah.
we actually broadcast that at the Fleet Science Center in Balboa Park. So I was there with an audience of hundreds.
Amazing.
Yeah, and it was an amazing experience. I wanted to thank you and NASA, of course, for sharing that joy with us because we could see that relief and joy that you're talking about. It was wonderful to share in it.
That's another great part. You're right that we do get to share those with everybody and also that people support us in doing that endeavor. I guess it's a wild thing. I often find myself thinking like it's amazing that this is a job because I really love it.
Well, if other people who are listening to this want that as their real job, when you meet kids and stuff like that, what do you recommend to them for going about getting a job at NASA or JPL to help with the space program?
The great thing that I learned, only after having worked there, and I think this is, where I got lucky in that I saw the engineers and scientists, right, who were landing the mission on Mars. But, once you're there, you sort of realize there's a whole bigger world of people who are participating in different ways, right? I mean, yes, there's the people in the control room, but there's, people who, make the software that allow us to do that. And there's people who, are administrators who make sure that we have office spaces. And there's and we were talking about sharing the story of NASA, right? There's videographers and people who take these maybe sometimes difficult scientific concepts and write them in a way that the public can understand why we're doing this and what we learned about Mars. And so it's kind of amazing to see that this is its own microcosm of the world, right? You have artists, you have writers, you have business people, administrators, you have engineers, you have scientists, people in the cafeteria making sure we have food, right? You've got sanitation, you've got thousands of people in the facility. We're basically a small city. So you really have people from all walks of life who are able to participate and contribute in different ways, and to their strengths and passions too, which I think is so cool. I still think the best advice that I can give anybody is if you can intern there, it's the easiest way to, of course, ultimately land a job, because we get to know you. We see that you're good at what you do. We see that, you have potential. And for the vast majority of times, I've seen almost every intern that we've had, not just me, but across the board, be asked if they'd like to join. So I think that's the easiest way.
Cool to know. I will definitely let my students know that.
Yeah, please.
Anything else you want to add?
No, this is so fun. I mean, I think it's just also great that all of us who, might be very smart, critical thinkers still get to enjoy some ridiculous, movies too. I don't know. Like, I think sometimes people think of all of us as like better than these things somehow. And I think that's very much the opposite. I revel in these things, or reality TV or whatever it is. I think we're human people doing very cool jobs, but ultimately we're still very, I think, normal people.
Right, exactly. And that's definitely part of what I like running, science panels at Comic-Con and stuff like that about, is like, just because I overthink it doesn't mean I'm not having a great time, Yeah. So some people who are just like, well, just enjoy it. I'm like, I'm also doing that. Don't worry. So
absolutely.
Well, are you on social media?
I don't do it as good as I used to. I would honestly tell everybody, go check out NASA's, what is X presence, Instagram, things like that. They're doing such a great job of storytelling, and I am occasionally doing it when I remember, but I get so distracted by the job. My mission's only, less than 5 months to launch right now, so it's pretty intense.
Are you allowed to share anything about the mission?
Yeah, of course. No, I'm working on a mission called NISAR, which is an acronym made up of acronyms. So it stands for NASA, ISRO, which is the Indian Space Research Organization, SAR, which is a synthetic aperture radar. So that's the acronym of the name of the mission. But we are an Earth orbiting, we will be, I guess we are currently in the process of building an Earth orbiting satellite with 2 radars on board. We will launch hopefully in 2024. And then in Earth orbit, we'll be measuring some of the landmass changes, looking at geological changes and processes, and also responding to hazards and things like earthquakes, and like how that changes our landscapes. Can provide real-time data to potentially for people in urban environments who maybe are trying to figure out which buildings are still intact and things like that, as well as a lot of data that's provided for agricultural reasons. So it's kind of cool coming from the planetary stuff to have something that's so practical in terms of its immediacy and the knowledge we provide.
My college students, even every time I ask them, like, what planets have we studied, which planets are we observing, they always leave Earth out. And I try to, so it's probably the one we're observing the most.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot. It's really fun. And it's really impressive. I mean, we level at which we can measure things from space. And
one of the research cruises I went on when I was doing oceanography was funded partially by NASA. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And it was like, oh yeah, we're just like ground truthing their satellites, up in the Arctic. And I was like, what? That's awesome. Like, I had no idea that that's what we were doing on that particular trip. So Bobak, we really want to thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us and talking about something as silly as the Fast and Furious.
Thank you guys. This was so fun. Just super fun to, geek out about something different.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to geek out with us.
Hopefully there'll be more space in the next movies so we can talk again.
Yes, exactly. Might as well go to Mars at this point. Maybe they'll give some tips or whatever,
Just
they'll
with
accidentally
really
get
slow
something
rovers.
Right. Yeah.
Just imagine the race at 1.7 inches per second of whatever that is. You get a couple 100 meters today, guys. It's just really gonna be.
I think Dominic Toretto's head would explode going that slow.
Oh, it's so great.
Hey, fellas, y'all seen 10-second cars? Say hello to the two-seat car.
Is that a Pontiac Fiero strapped to a rocket engine?
Impressive. I know.
No, that's not impressive.
Well, that wraps up this episode of The Facts and the Furious. We want to thank our guest, Bobak Ferdowsi, and we want to thank all of you for listening. Check out the show notes for links to more about NASA and other things that we talked about. And remember, reality-based physics comes and goes, but family is forever.
See you next time on The Facts and the Furious when we discuss the movie Fast X, Fast 10, who knows, and welcome a science advisor to the family.
Vroom.